and welcome to the Wormhole Podcast, episode 53. I'm Charlie Place, and joining me today is an author whose wonderful book about books debut was released last summer. We'll be talking about it today. The reading list is its name. Hello, Sara Nisha Adams.
Hi, Charlie. How are you?
I'm good. Yeah, it's a nice start to the new year. How are you?
It feels like this is the first thing I've done in months about the reading list, so it's really nice to kind of talk about it again.
Well, no, I've been excited about it and I'm glad to give you the opportunity to talk about it. You've worked at a few different publishers, including Headline, and you're now the editorial director at Hodder Studio. Can you tell us about your job?
Yes, absolutely. So I have been in publishing since, I think, 2014. I started as an intern, then a royalties assistant at a literary agency. And I think I always wanted to work with books and I wasn't quite sure what I wanted to do. I didn't really know that publishing was a thing until I was at uni. And as soon as I started working in publishing, I just fell in love with it. I sort of wanted to get into a proper publishing house to see what it's like to be a writer and how writers make money. I'd always wanted to be a writer throughout my whole life, but my mum really wanted me to do law. She saw that as a proper job, and writing, I think, was maybe not a proper job. So I thought I'd try and prove her wrong. And then as soon as I started working as an editorial assistant and then an assistant editor and editor, I had just fallen in love with working with authors and helping them get their stories out into the world. And I thought there was nothing more exciting than seeing a book either as just a germ of an idea or that first draft, and then months later seeing it as a finished copy in your hands. And from that point, I just loved publishing. So I've worked at Headline, and that was my first job where I kind of grew up there. I cut my teeth acquiring there as well and really loved it. After that, I moved to Harrow Road, where I worked on the crime list with some amazing authors like Ruth Ware and Abir Mukherjee and Denise Miner. And I adored that. The list was incredible, and the writers, while all writing in the crime space, were so varied and their imaginations were just incredible. After that, I joined Hodder Studio, which is where I am now, which is a brand new imprint. Well, I suppose we've been going about 2 years now, most of which has been in the pandemic. So it feels like it's still a new job. And I get to publish all sorts of reading group fiction and commercial fiction. I just really love stories with voice and character and a really good one-line pitch. I think that's the key things I look for in a book. And I love working with writers at all different stages of their career. Quite a lot of the authors on my list at the moment, because it's a new imprint, are debut authors. So that's been really lovely because I actually debuted with quite a few of the authors I was publishing too. So it was really nice to sort of experience what they were going through too and really empathise in that way. And publishing in a pandemic is a really different experience. And I think it's not really what any writer hopes for, obviously. I mean, who hopes for a pandemic at all? But it's just interesting to see the different ways that the book community has come together to support writers at this time. So I think really I'm just a book champion in every part of my career as an author and as an editor and a reader too.
Yeah, wonderful. I mean, you've managed to champion quite a number of books within your book in itself as well, which is quite lovely and matches what you're saying. And you say about how having a debut novel at the same time as some of your authors has been nice and the workings there. Can you tell us how being in publishing has directly affected your writing?
Yeah, I think it really has. Before I started working in the publishing industry at all, I was a really literary reader. I probably almost exclusively read books by my favourite authors, which was Zadie Smith, Ali Smith, as well as all the books that I studied at uni, whether they're classics or modern classics or books on the prize lists and things like that, as well as crime. I always read a lot of crime. That's just something I've always loved ever since I was a teenager, probably because my dad is a huge crime reader. But they were the main focuses of my reading. And then as soon as I started at Headline just has such an amazing commercial list and there's such breadth to their publishing. I just learnt so much more and so many different areas of books that I really adored and so many different styles of storytelling that I really enjoyed. So before then, I'd always sort of written quite well. I say literary, it was not literary. It was me trying to be literary and impressive and intellectual in that kind of very teenagery way. And I think I hadn't really found my voice. And then it was when I was working at Headline that I came up with the idea for this book. And I sort of wondered if this was the book that I should be writing all along. It was much more commercial, but I definitely thought about what the market was looking for at the time. And I'm not sure this is exactly what they wanted, but I think having my experience of working with authors, also sometimes coming up with ideas to present to authors, I had a better understanding of how to structure a book, how to make the book interesting at least, and how to come up with that USP for it. And I think really wanted to write a book that championed books, because obviously books have been a lot of my life, but libraries in particular, I felt that I really wanted to read more books about stories set in libraries and people meeting in libraries and the unlikely connections that that space can form. And I really wanted to write a book that had characters of colour in, because when I was younger, I rarely saw myself in fiction, but also in the commercial space, I think there are very few books that have characters of colour in, that the book isn't all about their experience of race or racism. And that's what I wanted. I wanted characters who were like the people in my life and my family, people I recognised, just living their life. But ultimately, it's their story, and it could be anyone's story too.
Well, I've obviously got loads of questions that we're going to go into that further in a moment. But before we do, have you got a crime novel in you?
No way. Having been a crime editor for so long, I'm just in awe of crime writers and how they structure plots and twists and everything. And that's something I just cannot do. I just love crime so much. I don't think I could write it. I don't think I'm clever enough to write a crime book, basically.
I'll let you off that one then. So if we introduce your book further, the reading list is about the unlikely friendship between Mukesh, a grieving widower who wants to become closer to his bookish granddaughter, and Aleisha, who works at the local library because she needed a job, really. Like Mukesh, she's not a reader. She also has problems at home. Aleisha discovers a reading list that she starts to share with Mukesh. We meet others in their community who also found copies of the list, and we witness the pair start to pull themselves out of the loneliness and isolation they were in. Sara, shall we start with your reading before we go into further questions?
Yes, absolutely. So I have taken a section from chapter 1, which is a point at which Mukesh, his daughters, are clearing out his wife's possessions, and they discover a book under the bed, which sort of sets him on his journey. Usually on a Wednesday, he'd unpack his shopping and then sit on his chair with his feet up, drinking a cup of hot and just right sweet chai, as Nana used to make it, now made using ready-mix sachets, and he'd plonk himself in front of ZTV or the news to keep his eyes away from the empty chair beside him, Nana's chair, and to fill his ears with sound, laughter and stern conversations, important world affairs, to keep his mind away from the deafening silence that had welcomed him home every day for 2 years now. For months after Nana's death, Mukesh hadn't been able to sleep in his own bed, because being in there alone felt like being in someone else's home entirely. "Papa, you take your time," Rohini had said to him at first, and Vritti had set up a bed in the living room for him. "He can't sleep there forever, he'll do his back in," Deepali had whispered to her sisters after tucking him in, a strange role reversal that made him feel an immense sense of shame. How could he be whole again when his whole had gone for good? "He'll be okay, he's grieving. I can't bring myself to go in the bedroom at all. But we're going to need to clear Mummy's stuff away. She kept it so messy," Rohini whispered back. Lying on the living room sofa, Mukesh had shut his eyes, hoping to block out the sound of their laughter, soft, comforting laughter. He was a father. He should be looking after his girls. But he couldn't. He didn't know how to without Nana. Once a year had passed, and Mukesh Patel's time of eternal quiet had begun, that silent, lonely stage of grief, where everyone but you had moved on. Rohini, Deepali and Vritti had insisted on finally clearing out Nana's room. "Papa, we're not letting you put this off any longer. It's time for you to move forward with your life." So they began sorting through the detail and debris of their mother's life, reorganising the organised chaos Nana thrived in. Deepali, who conveniently had dust allergies, opted to cook a lunch for them instead. For that one day, his house was full of life again, but for all the wrong reasons. As he listened to Deepali mixing batter in the kitchen, he stood in the doorway of his and Naina's bedroom, watching Riddhi and Rohini. They didn't know he was there. He was silent and invisible in his own home, a ghost of himself. Rohini took the lead, shouting instructions to Riddhi to root out the boxes under the bed, while she dashed around the room, returning a comb to its rightful place in a shoebox on the top of the wardrobe, folding up shawls and tidying them away into a big wheelie suitcase, and packing away handfuls and handfuls of bangles. Mukesh watched as they dragged box after box out from under the bed. Riddhi knelt to the floor, her cheek pressed against the carpet, and ran her hand to the left and to the right. All of a sudden, there was a clinking, clattering crash. "Oh God, what have you done?" Rohini groaned, staring down at her sister. Riddhi pulled the box out, revealing a now half-emptied yogurt pot of mismatched earrings. Next came the clerk's shoebox of photographs that had entertained them all for hours on end when the girls were little, sitting on Naina on Mukesh's knees, asking about their paisley-patterned clothes and garish flares. Mukesh had always thought they looked rather fashionable. The girls laughed at that. Then followed several pieces of empty Tupperware, and finally one lonely, dust-covered library book. Riddhi slowed her pace for a moment and held it in her hands as Rohini knelt down beside her sister. "Papa," they called loudly, still oblivious that he was only a few feet away. Deepali trotted into the room then too. "Mummy's book, well, library book," Rohini said. "I thought I'd returned them all, but I must have missed this one." She held it up to him, and he walked forward, not quite believing it, as though this dusty, icky, sticky book was some kind of mirage. When he'd seen the other relics of her life, he'd barely felt a thing, but here, seeing this book, the grey dust sticking to the plastic cover in splotches, it was like Naina was here in the room with them. Here with his 3 girls and one of Naina's beloved books. For a moment, just a moment, he didn't feel so alone.
Thank you. So I'm going to ask about that specific book in a bit, but if we can start, this book has a lot of you and your grandfather in it. Yes,
it's sort of inspired by the relationship I had with my grandfather when I was little. When I was younger, I didn't speak any Gujarati at all, which is the language my grandparents speak. And because of that, I always used to hide away and I couldn't quite join in. But my dada, he would always make sure that he involved me in conversation, and I would take a book with me when I went anywhere. And he'd always make sure that he'd ask me about the book I was reading before I left his house. So we had a conversation, and he just realised that books were the way into my world. I was really shy, but I could talk about books for hours. And I think he realised once I started talking about books, I could talk about things about myself relating to the book. So it was just a really lovely way to kind of instigate a relationship with me. And they're sort of quiet moments, but they're the moments that I remember most fondly. And yeah, I always remember him just taking the book I'm reading in his hands and reading the title out and then asking me all about it. And that's sort of where this story begins. I asked myself, what if I hadn't had that? What if he didn't ask me that? And that's, I guess, the inspiration behind Mukesh and Priya's relationship. Priya is his very bookish granddaughter, and Mukesh doesn't know quite how to connect with her, but he realises that if he wants a relationship with her, books are the way that he can do that.
So the lovely thing is you start from that place that's different, but then you work towards where you were with your grandfather almost.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, it's lovely. So the other character, where's Aleisha from?
So Aleisha is a young woman. I think Aleisha is basically me as a teenager, except without the love of books. She's working in the local library because her brother has sort of recommended that she should. He worked there when he was a teenager and he found solace there, and he feels that with everything that they've both got going on at home, the library might be a really lovely place for her. But when she's there, she's not really engaged. She's really bored. She feels like she's missing out on so many things that her friends are doing, like going on holiday or just having fun and being a teenager, being allowed to be a little bit carefree in a way that she's not really. And she meets Mukesh when he comes to ask for some book recommendations. She's not a reader at all. She's not really a librarian. She's just working there. She has absolutely no recommendations for him, and she finds the reading list and starts reading them and discovers that actually books can be an escape for her, and they're not just a way for her to be good at her job. And she uses books as a way to escape everything that's going on at home. Her mother goes through stages of depression where she doesn't want to leave the house, and Aleisha and her brother feel like they always want to be around for her. So she's got a lot on her shoulders at a very young age, and she's had to grow up very quickly. And I think books for her are both an escape, but they're also a way to connect to other people. She builds relationships through them. And they're also a way for her to feel a little bit less alone if she's seeing characters in books who are dealing with things either like what she's going through or dislike, but as stressful as what she's dealing with. She can see that there are ways to deal with her situation too.
I like that you say that. It gives a very good description, effectively, of what can be found in the book. So I'm going to ask about a different family member. You've spoken about your maternal grandfather. There's a lovely photo on your Instagram of your paternal grandmother, who you gave an early copy of your book to, and she's included in your acknowledgements. You say the book is here because you never wanted to tell her it's not going, as in, how's it going? Can you tell us more about how she influenced you?
Oh, yeah. I'm going to try not to get emotional. She's always been kind of the biggest champion for me ever since I was really young. She never said to me that I should be this or that. And she really just allowed me to be creative any way I wanted to be. And I remember every time I went to visit her, she'd always ask me what I was writing, because usually I'd always have a book on the go, trying to write a story. And quite often I would just forget about them or lose my way with them. And I hated it when I had to say to her, oh, I haven't done any writing for a while. I think she knew that that was always my dream, and I really wanted to achieve it. And with this book, I was so excited about the idea. I called my dad up. I called him up straight away, and he was like, oh, you have to tell Granny all about it. She'll be really excited. And I remember telling her about it, and she was like, oh, don't tell me anymore because I want to read it. And in 2020, she wasn't very well at various points. And that was the year that, I remember when the book deal was done in 2019, she was so worried that she wouldn't be here to read it because she realised that 2021, which is when it was publishing, was so far away. And she kept asking, why does it have to be such a long time? You've written the book. Can it be out now so I can read it? So yeah, when we heard that she wasn't very well, my dad just said, see if there's a way to get the draft you're writing printed so she can read it, because she just really wanted to read a full book by me. She'd read so many little stories I'd written when I was growing up. It felt like only right that she should read this. And my auntie read the book out to her, and yeah, she finished reading it, I think, just a few days before she passed away. So she did get to read it in the end. And while she didn't read the finished version, she read, as close to as possible. And my auntie thankfully took out all the swear words because, Granny didn't like swearing. So very thankful for that. But yeah, she's always been my champion and has always just known. Just her firm belief that one day I'd be a published writer was the thing I didn't want to let her down.
I'm sorry for your loss.
Thank you.
You've this list of books, starting with To Kill a Mockingbird, and it's ending with A Suitable Boy. Why the list you have? Why choose these books?
Yeah, everyone asks this question, and I wish I had a really good answer for it. But they're pretty much the first books I could think of when I thought about having a reading list in the book. And I think that's because pretty much all of them are books I read as a teenager, at that point in my life when I was sort of learning what kind of reader I am and what books I enjoyed. Quite a few of the books are actually books recommended to me on a reading list from one of my teachers who knew that I wanted to read beyond the books we were studying at school. And I wanted to see different characters in there, and I wanted books that were quite varied. And the order of the list as well is pretty much as I wrote it the first time, and it just felt right to me. I think the only one that got taken off the list but still plays a very major part in the book is The Time Traveller's Wife, and that was just a structural thing, really. But I love all those books for so many different reasons, and they're books I read when I was young, but they've stayed with me ever since. I think it's at that point where I every book I read so intensely and took so much from it. They've stayed with me since then, and it just felt right that they were in the book. I don't want to give any spoilers away, but the list does belong to one person, has been written by someone. So I was also trying to get into the head of this person and think, what would be the books on their reading list and why have they written this reading list? And I think this person is just like me. So the books that we share are some of our favourites. So yeah, and it's actually been really lovely pulling out connections between the books I wrote down and Aleisha and Mukesh. In many ways, I sort of became them as a reader, thinking, at this stage in their life, what would they pull out from this book and what would resonate with them at that stage? And it's been really nice to see these books that I love so much from a different perspective and through different eyes.
Mm-hmm. I know when I was reading it, I was thinking I want to see through reading why you chose these books at these times. And I think what struck me was that you've kind of got Mukesh grieving Naina and he's reading Rebecca at the same time. And you've kind of got a complete difference of Rebecca. Rebecca's obviously a haunting and Mukesh is haunted, but in a good way. Yeah. And I like that difference there.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think what I really liked as well was he's sort of haunted by his guilt too. And just this idea of him getting on with life for him feels like forgetting Naina, but actually everything he's doing are ways to let her live on longer.
Mm-hmm. Well, you say about that and her living on longer, and you have mentioned the time traveller's wife as well. And that was something that I wondered about its placement in the book. You've said that it was in the original one and then you changed where it is for structural reasons. Was it originally in the book in a similar way that it's included in the final version?
Not really. I think when I was writing it, it just came to a point when I really wanted the time traveller's wife to be in the list itself, because I think it would have been on the list, but also just structurally, basically for me, had to be the beginning of the story. I think it probably came out in the second draft, but it was the book that I'd always imagined would be the one that would take Mukesh to the library because of its themes of kind of love and fated love in so many ways, but also loss and learning about loss before it's even arrived. I think it was always quite a big part of the grief of both of the characters Aleisha and Mukesh go through too. So in a way, it sort of didn't just fit neatly into a position in their reading journey, I guess. It had to have more than one position, and it is the beginning of Mukesh's story, but it also pops up in Aleisha's story too at the right time. And I think because of that, it didn't quite work in the quite neat way that the reading list is a journey that they go on and they read them together. It sort of had to find each of the characters at the right time too.
Mm-hmm. Okay, yeah. You'd have to effectively have it as a reread, I suppose, for it to be on the reading list then. Yeah.
Yeah.
I'll ask this question now, because you've mentioned it. We learn at the end who wrote the list, and we don't need to say who it is. That's part of something for the reader to find out. But how important was their identity in revealing that to you?
I think really important for me. It basically, I think when I was pitching it to agents, I basically gave that twist away at the very beginning because it was such a big part of the novel for me. And it's probably quite convenient in some ways, but it's part of the magic, I think, of being able to share books. And while the list reaches so many different people, it's also intended for something and for someone or many people. And I really wanted that intention to be the final note of the book. And just this idea that it's a journey that Mukesh and Aleisha have been sent on for a very real reason, even though it sort of feels like it's just a coincidence, it's just fallen into their lap. But it was, I think, pretty much the first thing I thought of when I thought of the idea, and it just felt right to me. The difficult thing was how to reveal it and when to reveal it. And I know lots of people have probably already guessed when they're reading through, and some people hadn't guessed at all. So I always find that quite interesting, because I think even if you do have an inkling of who it might be or why the list has been written, I don't think it necessarily takes away from the enjoyment of it. It's quite serendipitous in a lovely way. And I really love that idea of serendipity, or things that might have gone on a slightly different journey coming back to the place that it was always meant to be in the end.
Mm-hmm. I thought of it as a possibility.
Yeah.
I was happy that it happened, you know. I think any of the possibilities would have been lovely. But no, it was a nice end to the book, and I will leave my reaction there so we don't spoil that bit. Of the reading list, you know, other people have a copy as well as Aleisha. Why did you include these chapters with other people? Why are they interspersed and we've got further stories of them?
Yeah, they weren't in the original draft I wrote, but it was always something I wanted to do. I'd always intended for there to be more than one reading list. I intended for there to be 8, I think, and they were all going to different places. And my editor, Charlotte, just mentioned that actually it'd be really nice to see what these lists do to other people and where they find them. And of course, some of them are missed opportunities, people who see them but don't think twice about them, or other people where it sparks something in them. And I think it's sort of just this idea. I have this fascination with lists anyway. I really like lists. And then I was also talking to one of my friends, Izzy, and it turns out she collects lists too. I just love this idea that if I ever see a note or something that's handwritten in a shopping basket or in a library or something that's a connection to another person, I just really love that idea of having these really transient moments of connection with people who you don't know, and you might pass them on the street every day. And I think those little moments are really important when you're living in a big city and everything feels quite anonymous. And I think the idea of having a book list, it sort of feels like they're showing you a little bit of their soul. And I love the idea of these little bits of this person's soul making its way around the community. So yeah, I just loved sort of seeing how different people react to the books, but also the list itself as an object and as a piece of someone else.
Mm-hmm. So, I mean, do you have any idea of what reading lists these other characters might create themselves? What other books they might move on to?
Not really. I would love to know, but I haven't really interrogated them that much. And I sort of love the idea that some of them are thinking about the books as films first and foremost, because maybe books weren't such a major part of their life. But also there's a guy who reads crime thrillers. I just love that he presumably read the list, or at least read a few books on the list, which is completely different to what he reads. But I would love to know his crime thriller list, because I would probably read every book that he recommends.
And he'd probably say, well, you have to write it for me then, Sarah.
Yeah, no.
But that's lovely. So Izzy is obviously not completely a real person, but based on real circumstances as such.
Yeah, she is.
Yeah, no, it's lovely. We'll move on to another subject. Mukesh's chapters often begin with answerphone messages, where his daughters are checking up on him, telling him what to do, that sort of thing. It's written in the same basic format each time, but the content changes over time. What led you to include this sort of narrative device or structure?
Yeah, I really wanted to get across the idea that Mukesh's daughters are very much looking after him, and they're trying to keep his routines and show that they're checking in, but they are not quite connecting with him or having conversations with him or spending time with him, really. And I think that is a common thing, especially when at the stage in your life when you're looking after your parents. It can feel easy to do all the practical things without necessarily spending quality time with them. And I wanted to sort of show that in a very clear way. And I think voicemails or text messages, I think Mukesh probably wouldn't text very much, but the voice messages, I think, are a really good way to show that they're telling him things, but they're not actually listening back. But gradually that changes over time, and they start to think more about his life, and their connections with him grow. And I think he builds confidence in going outside of his routine a little bit by going to the library and making new friends, something he hasn't done in a very long time. And that impacts the relationships that he's had for a very long time that might have become a little bit stagnant or very much one-sided. I love the voicemails. I found them so funny because I can hear all the voices of the daughters really quite clearly. And I think just this idea that he wakes up every morning bombarded by these messages, first feeling a little bit nagged, but then eventually it feels as though he's starting to be able to have a conversation with his daughters in the way that he always wanted.
Yeah, it's interesting you say about the voice. I didn't hear voices, but I think maybe the way you'd written it with the italics and stuff, capital letters, I heard the beep in my head, and that really kind of gave me an idea that, you know, we'd moved to a different place in the chapter emotionally. But no, it's a nice way of showing the progress. And obviously, of course, I suppose they are literally distant, these daughters, until they aren't.
Yeah, absolutely.
The way you write about Aleisha's book-loving brother, Aiden, there's a glimpse for the reader of what might be going on, well balanced with what could be a mask he's putting on. What was important about Aiden's role in the book for you?
I love Aiden as a character. I think he's probably one of my favourite characters. I think he very much takes on a role later on where he's sort of just looking after his family, and he's very much holding his family on his shoulders and feeling the weight of that responsibility. And with that comes an inability to really talk about what's important to him. I think quite a lot of the conversations Aleisha and Aiden has, Alicia's definitely thinking about her brother, but he's also her rock. He's the one who's always there for her. But you don't often see what's going on for Aiden. You kind of see little glimpses of him having to work 2 jobs and being out of the house a lot, and trying to get him and Aleisha having rotas when they're going to be in the house with their mum. And I think the insight you get into him is his love of reading, and how that for him was a really lovely escape and something that he made time for and really cherished when he was younger. But it's something that he doesn't do quite as much now. And him sharing that with Aleisha is his way of saying, this is what's important to me, and I really hope you find something here for you too. Just really wanted Aiden to sort of signal the importance of the fact that he might look okay on the outside and be dealing with everything really well and in a very adult way, and he's holding a lot on his shoulders, but he never reveals what's going on for him. And I think throughout the whole book, I just wanted this message of kindness to come through, and you never know what someone else is going through.
Mm-hmm. Further on this, you do a good job of showing Leilah. Was it important to you to kind of stay away from discussing what it could be that Leilah suffers from?
Yes, that was something I really wanted to do from the very beginning, both as a way for other people to be able to see their own lives reflected in Leilah, Aleisha and Aiden's story without necessarily pigeonholing it with a label. But also for me, Leilah was never diagnosed with a mental health issue. She never spoke to a health professional about what she was going through. It was something that she, Aleisha and Aiden dealt with themselves. They kept it quite secret from lots of people, which is another reason they sort of didn't let other people into their world. And I wanted to have that in there because I think while we talk about mental health issues and mental illness a lot more these days than we used to, and there's less stigma around it, there is still stigma around it, and it does stop people asking for help, especially with different cultural backgrounds. I know that with my cultural background, it is still something we don't talk about a lot, and we keep it to ourselves, and it feels as though even though we know that it's an illness, it's not necessarily something that reflects us as human beings. It still feels as though it's something that's hard to talk about. I wanted to convey the difficulties that can cause in a family situation, and how so many families are dealing with things on their own without ever asking for outside help. And that very much is quite a key part of Aleisha, Aiden and Leilah's story.
Mm-hmm. You have the Harrow Road Library, which I believe is a fictional library.
Yes, it is.
And they're trying to save it. I think it's Firmus Flask, as they call him, wants to save the library, and they're all trying to save the library. Is this based on a particular library?
I think it's based on a few libraries. So the Harrow Road Library itself doesn't exist. It is a fictional library, and there are loads of wonderful libraries in Wembley. The building itself, I've always had in my head, there's Barham Park Community Library, which is a volunteer-run library, and it's a beautiful building right by Barham Park on the Harrow Road. So that's the building I had in my head with a few modifications. But the library itself, I think, is kind of inspired by my library that I used to go to as a child in Hertford. I think it was a converted church, I'm not sure. But it was in this beautiful grand building, and it eventually closed down and did open up many years later. But I remember the time when it closed down, and it had been such a big part of my weekly routine, going to the library every week with my dad, picking out a stack of books, going every summer to do the reading challenge. And it was so important to me that I was really sad when it closed down. I don't think we knew at the time that it was going to find a new site, but it felt like such a loss for so many young people and so many people who use the library. more than just because it's a place for books. I used to go there after school when it was raining, just to spend some time with my friends and do some homework. When I couldn't necessarily go home, I found it such an important place for me growing up. And I think libraries can be safe spaces for so many people. And you don't have to have any kind of background to be in a library or to find books that you love, or to just sit in a quiet place and think and be around other people without necessarily having to talk to anyone. And I think that's quite an important thing that a library does as a space, rather than just as somewhere to borrow books. I know that there are so many libraries that have suffered from funding cuts over the years, and it's always so heartbreaking to hear of a library closing down, because there will be a community who love that library, and young mums who took their children to libraries, parents and families who went there at the weekend to introduce their children to books. And I love that libraries are places where you can try any book you want and really discover yourself as a reader without having to buy a book and feel like you're committing to this book and that you need to love this book. That's how I became a reader, because I could borrow any book I wanted. And the library, Harrow Road Library, in my head, it's the library from my 90s childhood, and very stuck in its ways, but it's such a great community hub. And I wanted a Harrow Road Library to reflect both the love of books, but also the importance to the community and how that's worth saving in itself.
There's something about libraries stuck in their ways that can be very special as well.
Absolutely, yeah.
What's the next book for Mukesh and Aleisha? What's the next book they would be reading?
That's a really good question. Oh, that's really good. I'm not sure. I would love them to read another Toni Morrison book, and I think it would be really interesting if they read more Daphne du Maurier, because I think Mukesh, he was so haunted by Rebecca. I kind of would be interested to know what he feels about some of her other books where maybe the storyline doesn't strike such a strong chord with him, and he can kind of really immerse himself in the story. For Aleisha, I would love her to read some Martina Cole books, because Aiden has loads of Martina Cole books, so I'd love to see what she thinks about those and just really enjoy them. Yeah, maybe they should read some more crime. They don't read enough crime in the list. So I think some really modern crime thrillers would be great, especially Mukesh. I think it'd be fun to see what he makes of some good psych thrillers.
Their little two-person book group can become three then, with the crime thriller guy.
Yeah, I think so. Yeah, Chris can come up with the next list.
I actually expected you've got a cousin Rachel in there, and I was fully expecting there to be some references there. I don't know if that was something that you'd considered.
Oh yeah, I'm glad you picked. Yeah, it was fully intentional that her cousin was called Rachel. And yeah, maybe they should read that one next.
Awesome. You've included your own reading list at the end of the book in the acknowledgements. Can you tell us about your very favourite books?
Yes, so I basically could have written a massively long list for the list in the book, but I wanted to also reflect the books that have touched me after my teenage years and books that I've discovered more recently. I think my very favourite novel is The God of Small Things by Arundhati Roy. It's just one of the most beautiful, intense, mesmerising books I've read in so long. And I think I read it when must have been 18, maybe a bit younger. But I've read it about 7 times since, because the prose is just so beautiful. And the way that Arundhati Roy uses language to evoke emotion, and especially I think the way that she uses food to convey love, is just so beautiful and has stayed with me ever since. And it's a really heartbreaking book, but it's so stunningly written and it's so vivid in my mind. I can see all the images. Sometimes I can't believe that I haven't met these characters myself, because they're so real in my mind. So I think that's one of my absolute favourites. White Teeth by Zadie Smith as well is one of the books I think really formed me as a reader and a writer. One of my teachers at university recommended it to me when I was sort of telling her that I didn't feel like I was seen in books at all, and all the areas of London I knew when I read them in books, it was always the fancy places like Hampstead or Chelsea or whatever. And I didn't know those places at all. I knew Wembley, I knew North West London, because that's where my family live, and that's the only part of London I really knew. And she recommended White Teeth to me, and I just fell in love with it because it's the first time I'd seen a really multicultural cast of characters that felt like they were people I knew in my life. And it's just so funny and so sharp, and I really love all the themes that pop up. It's just such a great book, I think, for writers who want to learn about how to write a really great, compelling story that is packed full of meaning too. Both of those books have twins in. I think I have a fascination with twins. But yeah, they're my top two books, and I will read them for the rest of my life again and again.
Did you also like Zadie Smith's NW?
Yes, I love that book for very different reasons. I've read all of her books so many times, but NW I did one of my dissertations on when I was at uni because I loved it so much. But I just really love this idea of how Zadie Smith really cleverly writes about the contradictions of London throughout the characters and as a place and a person in itself. And I think NW, I really loved the writing style of it. I know it was really quite different to White Teeth, but it just felt quite arresting to me. I remember reading it and just feeling like I need to read it again from beginning to end straight away to pick up all the things that I missed first time round.
I remember it's got that kind of literal, is it a tree, a picture of a tree in words or something?
Yeah.
Yeah. No, it was a good book. Your dad wanted to wait until the book was published before reading it. Has he read it now? What does he think of it?
He has not read it.
Oh my goodness, okay. Get on with that.
I know. I think he's very worried that he won't like it. But, or I think he was worried about reading it before it was published in case he didn't like it and gave me any constructive criticism that crushed my confidence. Now I think my mum is going to read it out loud to him because, yeah, he's enjoyed us reading Richard Osman out loud to him and he can just sit and enjoy it. So, yeah, I think that's what mum's planning. I think he's been nervous to start. But yeah, I really want to know. He keeps talking about it because he's read all the reviews for it. So he basically knows everything about it. So he keeps talking to me as though he knows what it's about. And I just keep having to remind him, Dad, you haven't read it yet. He's bought like 3 copies and hasn't read a single one of them. But hopefully soon.
Well, if your mum's effectively got control of where he hears it, that's good. It'll happen. Yeah.
Yeah.
To sum up, what is the most important thing or things about reading to you?
I think the most important things for me is the ability to, it sounds really cheesy, but as it says, it's like in To Kill a Mockingbird, it's like the ability to walk in someone else's shoes. That's what I really love about books. I can learn so much about so many different characters and feel like I've got friends in all these different books, all because of reading. I find it quite amazing that words written on a page can create images in your mind and introduce you to people. Like, it feels like that's some kind of magic. So I think that's the most important thing to me, the ability to connect, but also beyond that is the ability to connect with other people who've read the same books as you. And I think quite often that is something that I love to share with friends and family and my partner. We often read the same books and I just love talking to people about books and seeing what they think about things. And that moment when you share your favourite book with someone, it's quite a scary moment because you don't want them to dislike a book that you treasure. But it's just, that feels like a really lovely thing to share books with people. It's sort of showing a little bit of your soul because I think every book has a little bit of anyone in them because of the human experience. Yeah, I'm babbling now, but I just love books.
I think everyone listening would resonate with babbling about books. That's what we do, isn't it? We're readers.
Yes.
What's next for Sara, your own books?
I have written another book that's about unlikely friendships and it's similar in tone, but it's got a dual timeline, which has been very scary as a writer. And it's basically about community and connection and coming together through gardening. It was an idea that I had before the pandemic. And when I lived in a flat that had no garden, and I was basically trying to manifest a garden and a community garden. And now I live somewhere with a garden, have been doing a lot of gardening, and we've also got a community garden too. So I feel like I've literally manifested it through this book idea, but it's been really nice just sort of exploring what a garden can mean to people and all the themes of nature that have in our own lives. So yeah, that's book 2.
We will try to be patient to wait for it then. Sara, it's been lovely having you today. It's actually been an evening. It's been lovely ending the day talking to you about your book, and it's just been such a special book to read. It's been one of those amazing books that have been quietly wonderful, which is just such a special thing in books. Thank you so much for being here today. It's been lovely talking to you.
Thank you so much, Charlie. Thank you for having me on. It's been really nice to speak to you.
Links to purchase the reading list are in the episode description. If you have enjoyed today's discussion, do subscribe or follow the podcast on your listening app of choice. It's free. The Wormhole Podcast, episode 53, was recorded on the 6th of January and published on the 24th of January 2022. Music and production by Charlie Place.